I've got some exciting news to start off the third part of this Monday American Revolution series. We are going to be doing our first ever giveaway on the show. Pretty pumped about that. What we have is a $50 gift card to Panera, and it's pretty simple to get. So I was thinking about this the other day, and I was thinking that so far I've pretty much only covered the topics of history that I'm really wanting to cover the most, where I have the biggest passion. But it dawned on me that although I don't understand why, my interest might not be the interest of everyone else. So please read that or listen to that with some sarcasm. I got to thinking and eventually lined up a little bit of someone gave a donation to the show and said give it as a giveaway. So all you have to do to win a $50 gift card to Panera, which I will mail to you, is email your show idea. All I want to know is what topic you want to hear about. You can send an email to contact@themondayamerican.com. You can tweet us at Monday American, or you can post a comment on our Facebook page, or do the form on the website at themondayamerican.com. So, once again, that is contact@themondayamerican. All you need to do is submit your ideas for the next series you want to hear about, and whoever chooses that topic that ends up getting chosen by me and we'll call it a delegation of a couple other people will receive the gift card, and we will make sure that the first person to suggest the idea, if there are multiples, is the one who gets the gift card. We'll keep this fair and square. It's $50. It's not going to ruin your life, but send an email to contact@themondayamerican, Facebook, Twitter, tweet us at Monday American. You can even fill out the contact info on the website and submit a comment that way. We are really excited about this, and we hope that you are too.
It's history like you've never heard it before. You're listening to The Monday American with your host, Andrew Garrett.
So last time we finished talking about Washington's odd success at the Battle of Dorchester Heights, and that was the culmination of the siege of Boston. This episode kind of takes all that success and just puts it in front of a speeding train, and you just kind of watch it crumble up and explode. Because if for every success that Washington and the Continental Army had in the battle, in that siege of Boston, Battle of Dorchester Heights, and that amazing feat of setting up all those soldiers across ice and all the cannons overnight, for every one success that they had doing that, it almost seems like there were two failures involved with the Battle of New York. And that's just kind of how this battle went for George Washington. Now, you remember at the beginning of last episode when I mentioned that hypothetical situation where if you were hired to do a job, and what would happen if you started weeping and breaking down, how long do you think you'd have that job? This is the moment where George Washington breaks down. He has his lowest moment, and he has to figure out a way to overcome what has just happened to him in New York, and to figure out a way to carry on the spirit of the revolution. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of this series, is he embodies the revolution. So he has to figure out a way not to watch it just choke and suffocate out. And like George Washington does so often, he finds a way to still inspire his troops against insurmountable odds and just truly dire circumstances, and he leads, and he really he pulls it all together. So for the very first time in well over a year, because the Continental Army had been pretty much camping out and sieging the city of Boston and fighting the British there, George Washington's Continental Army was on the move. For more than 2 weeks, its long, irregular columns would wind through the untroubled countryside of lower Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, where there were a lot of open fields, low-lying wooded hills. They were only now showing in the first faint signs of spring. In plenty of market towns and crossroad hamlets, the local population would come out and cheer for them. They'd offer food and drink, or just stand at the gates and doorways, just taking in the spectacle of so many of their countrymen armed and on the march. Whole regiments would pass for 2 or 3 hours at a time. Large armies of any kind, were unfamiliar sight to Americans, to say the least. No army of such a size as this had ever been seen before anywhere in the colonies. And they were marching with great speed. And the reason for that speed with which they were marching was because the British were already in New York. They had been there for a while. So, for example, on April 5th, it was the day the Commander-in-Chief, George Washington, marched into Providence, Rhode Island. The locals came out and greeted him, and he was given an eloquent banquet provided by the gentlemen of the town. Washington was feted and toasted, a toast that was befitting a national hero, but at first light the next day, he was on his way again with no time to spare. His fifer, John Greenwood, would remember everyone moving, quote, at great speed. It was normal for a 5 or 6 mile march before breakfast. 15 to 20 miles a day was about the average. When it was wet and unpredictable as far as weather or just bad roads, even towards the winter with frost coming out of the ground, it could be slick with mud for even fair days. They would march a little bit less, not much. One soldier named Solomon Nash, who was marching with the Massachusetts Artillery Company, only made, and he made a note in his diary, because of, quote, wet weather and very bad traveling, they only made 10 to 14 miles while moving 10 brass field pieces. And these brass field pieces, I don't know if you've been to Home Depot and picked up a brass fitting, those things are heavy, and these are brass cannons. And they had to march 15 miles with that, moving 10 of them. And it didn't trouble him anything like he had expected. Lieutenant Joseph Hodgkins wrote to his wife after a few days on the road, quote, I am willing to serve my country in the best way and manner that I am capable of. And as our enemy are gone from us, I expect I must follow them. I would not be understood that I should choose to march, but as I am engaged in this glorious cause, I am willing to go where I am called. But by whatever means they traveled and however fast they did, they all seemed to understand what lay ahead. They were going to meet the enemy on the field of battle for the very first time, rather than accepting them. They were headed for, quote, trouble, spelled Trouble, as one man wrote. No one knew how many British there might be, and very few of them let that bother them at all. A very enthusiastic new recruit in the Connecticut ranks, a farm boy named Joseph Plum Martin, would recall, quote, I never spent a thought about numbers. The Americans were invincible in my opinion. As another soldier remembered, there was scarcely a militiaman who did not think himself equal to 2 or 3 of the British soldiers. When Washington was appraising the situation from his new headquarters at number 1 Broadway, which was a big townhouse on the southern tip of New York, he had no illusions about the difficulties they were facing. He was gravely and realistically apprehensive about the magnitude of the enemy that was on their way. He fretted over when the ships might appear and how, with no naval strength, to defend a city that was completely surrounded by water. New York was not at all like Boston, geographically, strategically, and in so many other ways. At Boston, Washington had known exactly where the enemy was and who they were and what was needed to contain them. At Boston, the British had been largely at his mercy, and especially once winter set in. Here, with the overwhelming naval might and absolute control of the waters, they could strike at will and from almost any direction. The time and place of battle would be entirely their choice, and this was the worry overriding all of his other worries. Now, the reason that they were in New York in the first place was because Washington made his first error and telling Congress that he had not a doubt that he could defend the city, and he was eager to do so, even for all his anxieties about it. New York had, quote, vast importance, he wrote, because of control of its harbor could mean control of the Hudson River, thereby controlling the Lake Champlain corridor north to Canada, which if they seized that, if that was seized by the enemy, they could isolate New England from the other colonies, which in fact was exactly the British intention. So he was right there, but he was very confident that he could defend it. But the decision to make a stand at New York was based more on Washington's political judgment than on military strategy. And this is one of the things that gets lost in the story, is Washington's political genius that he navigated through the war with. It was his sense that Congress and the patriots of New York expected every effort to be made to hold the city, and that anything less would have devastating political effect on the people at large, and therefore the American cause, which Washington was fervently hoping would quickly become the cause of American independence. Because remember, at this point, they weren't sure if independence was the answer yet or not. He had discussed the subject of New York with the members of Congress the previous year before leaving to take command at Cambridge. John Adams wrote him a letter on January 6 describing New York as, quote, a kind of key to the whole continent, and affirming that, quote, no effort to secure it ought to be omitted. Still, Congress had issued no specific directive to defend the city, and the decision was Washington's alone. He promised unequivocally, quote, to exert myself to the utmost to frustrate the designs of the enemy. And you can almost hear the sarcasm in his voice as he writes that. One of the unexpected differences of the battle for Washington, when you took in comparison between Boston and New York, was at Boston there were, comparatively to New York, there were very few loyalists of Massachusetts. They had either fled the country or were bottled up with the British because the British were stuck in that town. There had never been a serious threat from, quote, internal foes, in Washington's phrase. In New York, the atmosphere was entirely different. The city remained divided and tense. Loyalist or Tory sentiment, while less conspicuous than it had been, was widespread and ranged from the militant to the disaffected to those hesitant about declaring themselves patriots for a variety of reasons. Trade and commerce not being the very least of them. Remember, these people were still living their lives. 2/3 of the property in New York belonged to Tories. The year before, in 1775, more than half of the New York Chamber of Commerce were avowed loyalists. When on a Sunday in January of 76, a prominent pastor, Reverend John Rogers, preached an impassioned sermon from the pulpit of the Presbyterian Church on Wall Street, exhorting young men to be brave and fight for the cause of their country. He was himself being notably brave in speaking out. Quote, we are involved in the calamities of a civil war, he had said, and so it felt like in New York. Now, the city of Long Island would provide Washington with 5 whole regiments just by the summer, and they would be led by very well-known officers, Livingston, Roosevelt, Remsen, Cowanhoven, among many others. But the number of loyalists in the city still were considerably large, and they were from all walks of life and class. Across the East River on Long Island, for example, in the villages and the rich outlying farmlands, the population was still mostly Dutch. Loyalists were a decided majority. Staten Island, at the far end of the harbor, or the Upper Bay, was another Loyalist stronghold. Thus, the potential for conspiracy, sabotage, or organized armed resistance was all too real. At that moment, armed Loyalist bands were in hiding in the swamps of Long Island, awaiting for their chance to take action. And if that wasn't enough, Washington also had to worry about the water and the Navy. For months, British warships, which included the 64-gun ship named Asia, had been a formidable presence in the Upper Bay, just serving as reminders that the city was entirely at their mercy. It was on April 8th, just a week before Washington's arrival, that the Asia and its entourage withdrew to the outer approaches to the harbor beyond the Narrows. On board the king's ship of the Duchess of Gordon, William Tryon, a seasoned soldier politician who was the royal governor of New York, maintained a headquarters and was believed to be secretly directing Loyalist operations. So at Boston, Washington had benefited greatly from a steady supply of valuable intelligence that would come out of the besieged town, because there's always stragglers that come out of besieged towns, and they give up info for food or water or whatever they need. Now, while General Howe had known little or nothing of Washington's strengths or intentions in Boston, here, with so much of the population still loyal to the king, this situation was entirely reversed. Now, even though Washington's army was exhausted from that march up to New York, they were intact and they were getting more men. Washington's concern was that the status of their situation was going to tear the army and the country apart. They were urgently needed. And for example, he wrote to John Adams, quote, "We have nothing, my dear sir, to depend on but the protection of a kind providence and unanimity among ourselves." I apologize for my kindergarten level of speaking. He wrote that to John Adams. And as Washington knew, discipline was hardly improved in the army. Too many of the new troops were raw recruits, as unruly as those of the summer before. Some who were lauded as shining examples of patriotism, they hardly looked fit for battle. Like the Connecticut unit comprised entirely of, quote, aged gentlemen, which, according to an old written account, quote, "When they were ordered to New York, this company was the first that reached the place of rendezvous. They were 24 in number, and their united ages reached 1,000. They were all married men, and left behind 159 children and grandchildren." That just goes to show you the experience level of these troops, or the physical abilities of these troops that Washington had. He didn't have an army like the British. These were professional soldiers they were dealing with. He was getting old men, were 24 of them. If you added their ages, they reached 1,000. I mean, that's not exactly a military-aged male company if you're looking at statistics like that. But amongst all these odds, it was something that Washington had dealt with before, and he felt confident he could deal with it again. So it came time to make the plan. Now, under Washington was a general named Lee, who was considered an expert on defense, and he had concluded that without the command of the sea, New York could not be held, but, as he had said, it could be an advantageous battlefield. If the British were determined to take the city, they could be made to pay a heavy toll. Now, crucial to Lee's plan was defense of that part of Long Island directly across the East River, and particularly the imposing river bluffs near the tiny hamlet called Brooklyn, which was also spelled Breucklyn, amongst a whole lot of other ways to spell it. It amounted to no more than 7 or 8 houses and an old Dutch church that stood in the middle of the Jamaica Road, the main road inland from the Brooklyn Ferry Landing. Quite a bit has changed today, obviously. From the New York side of the river, the village was out of sight, 3/4 of a mile back from the partly wooded noble bluff known as Columbia Heights or Brooklyn Heights. All you would see if you were looking across from New York, as Washington frequently did, was the steep face of the bluff rising above the river and crowned now by the beginnings of Fort Sterling. To the right, also on the brow of the bluff, the country house of Philip Livingston, a wealthy New York importer and delegate to the Continental Congress. When finished, the large square bastion of Fort Sterling, which had 8 cannons, was expected to command the East River and New York, just as Dorchester Heights commanded Boston and its harbor. From Brooklyn Heights, one looked down on all of New York City, the harbor, rivers, everything. It was one of the greatest views to be seen on the entire Atlantic seaboard at the time. The East River, which was not really a river but a saltwater estuary, was nearly a mile wide, was famously difficult to navigate, and it had swift currents and tides as high as 6 feet, which made it difficult to cross. Even with 3 men pulling at the oars, crossing the river could take over an hour. The Hudson, or North River, was greater still, with more than 2 miles wide, so Lee had acknowledged that was impossible to keep close to the enemy. But with batteries along the New York shore of the Hudson, the British might think twice before risking their valuable ships. Washington tended to agree with his general in his general outlines of the plan, including, most importantly, the premise that an effective defense of New York City would depend on the defense of Long Island. If New York was the key to the continent, then Long Island was the key to New York, and the key to defense of Long Island was Brooklyn Heights. Lee wrote Washington, "For should the enemy take possession of New York when Long Island is in our hands, they will find it almost impossible to subsist." Now, even for all the confidence that General Lee had and Washington had in his plan, they were still desperately short of men. According to his own returns, Washington had 88 8,880 men at hand, 6,923 of whom were fit for duty, and at the same time he received reliable word that no fewer than 17,000 hired German troops were on the way. This was a struggle of Washington's throughout the entire war. He was either losing soldiers to their term running out, their conscription running out. They wouldn't renew. They would want to go home. They just died from sickness and obviously from war. But he had a serious problem throughout the entire war of just having enough warm bodies to mount an attack or make a defense. And just when you think it couldn't get any worse, those 17,000 Hessians, they made the British total forces strength as many as 30,000. That's 30,000 men against 6,923. Washington was called to Philadelphia to consult with Congress. Arrangements were made for fast horses to be held ready at intervals along the road so that if necessary he could get back to New York with the utmost expedition. It was the first time that he had left the army since taking command. No sooner had he departed on May 21st, leaving General Putnam in charge. Rumor had spread that he had gone to Philadelphia to resign his command. When he returned on June 6th, after an absence of 2 weeks, it was to a rousing welcome with drums rolling and 5 regiments parading. Quote, "Through Broadway we marched. Round the King's statue," wrote Lieutenant Bangs, jubilant, like all in the army, the commander's presence among them once more. That should speak a lot to the type of man that Washington was and how much these troops, these soldiers really looked up to him. They thought without him they had no chance. So the one positive development for Washington was that during his stay in Philadelphia, he had convinced Joseph Reed to rejoin the army to serve as the army's adjutant general, its administrative head, with the rank of colonel in place of General Horatio Gates, who had been sent by Congress to see what he could do about Canada. Reed returned full of misgivings. He questioned his fitness for the job. Quote, "It is so entirely out of my line," he told his wife. In a few days he was ready to quit again, but Washington's faith in the gifted Reed and his need for a confidant were no less than ever. To Washington his return was a godsend. And suddenly, with the impact of an explosion, news of a loyalist plot to assassinate the commander-in-chief burst upon the city. A dozen men were arrested, including the mayor of New York, and 2 soldiers from Washington's own bodyguards were arrested as well. The plot reportedly was to kill Washington and his officers the moment the British fleet appeared. Patriot mobs took to the street to hunt down loyalists. Those they seized were beaten, tarred, and feathered, burned with candles, or made to ride the rail, which was a cruel punishment whereby a man was forced to straddle a sharp fence rail, which would be held on the shoulders of 2 men, with other men on either side taking a grip on his legs to keep him straight, and thus the victim was paraded through the streets. When it was all said and done, besides the mayor and the others arrested and imprisoned included 2 doctors, a shoemaker, a tailor, a chandler, and a former schoolteacher. But only one of the soldiers that were arrested and his lifeguard, his bodyguard, were convicted, an English immigrant named Thomas Hickey. And his defense was that he had gotten involved only to, quote, "for the sake of cheating Tories and getting some money from them." Well, Hickey was hanged before an enormous crowd on June 28th, a fate that most in the army approved of. Now that same night, Washington learned for the first time that the British had sailed from Halifax bound for New York on June 9th. And when they arrived at force. Henry Knox was at breakfast with his wife at Washington's headquarters when he saw the fleet. It had become his practice to enjoy breakfast beside a large Palladian window on the 2nd floor with a panoramic view of the harbor. But now suddenly the morning was shattered, and his wife was in a state of abject terror. He wrote about the incident of when he first saw the fleet, quote, "You can scarcely conceive of the distress and anxiety which she then had," he would write about it, his wife to his brother. "The city in an uproar, the alarm guns firing, the troops repairing to their posts, and everything in the height of bustle. I not at liberty to attend her, as my country cries loudest." By sunset later that day, the British had dropped anchor with 100 ships in the harbor. The details on the makeup of this enemy armada quickly followed the armada itself. The ships included the Centurion and the Chatham. Both had 50 guns. It included the 40-gun Phoenix and the 30-gun Greyhound with General Howe on board. In addition to the 64-gun Asia, in their combined firepower, these 5 warships alone far exceeded all American guns now in place on shore. Nathaniel Greene reported to Washington that the total fleet of 120 ships had 10,000 troops received at Halifax, besides some of the Scotch Brigade that have joined the fleet on the passage. And as Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Webb of Washington's staff further noted, an additional 15 to 20,000 men could be expected hourly on still more ships from England under the command of General Howe's brother, Admiral Lord Richard Howe. The whole of New York was in commotion. The pastor of a local church there wrote, quote, "On the one hand, everyone that could was packing up and getting away, and on the other hand, country soldiers from the neighboring places came in from all sides." On Long Island, one of Nathaniel Greene's field officers took time to pen a note to his son back home in Newburyport, Massachusetts, and he wrote, "I am of opinion our hands will be full." He was a veteran of Bunker Hill. Despite these formidable odds with that navy that was just within arm's reach, it seemed, not too far away in Philadelphia, the same day that they landed in Staten Island, on July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress, in a monumentous decision, voted to, quote, "dissolve the connection with Great Britain." The news reached New York 4 days later on July 6th, and at once spontaneous celebrations broke out. Quote, "The whole choir of our officers went to a public house to testify our joy at the happy news of independence. We spent the afternoon merrily," wrote one local named Isaac Bangs. A letter from John Hancock to Washington, as well as the complete text of the Declaration, followed 2 days later. The letter that he wrote to Washington said, "That our affairs may take a more favorable turn, the Congress have judged it necessary to dissolve the connection between Great Britain and the American colonies, and to declare them free and independent states. As you will perceive by the enclosed declaration, which I am directed to transmit to you, and to request you will have it proclaimed at the head of the army in the way you shall think most proper." By renouncing their allegiance to the king, the delegates at Philadelphia had committed treason and embarked on a course from which there could be no turning back. Quote, "We are in the very midst of a revolution," wrote John Adams, "the most complete, unexpected, and remarkable of any in the history of nations." Washington had the Declaration of Independence read aloud to all the soldiers, and he issued orders for all men, all officers in the Continental Army, wherever they may be in the country, to read out loud the Declaration of Independence. The soldiers were overjoyed, and a massive celebration broke out. But 3 days later, the celebration came to an abrupt end. The British decided to test out all these defensive forts, guns, and cannons that the Americans had been spending all their time building. And on a brilliant summer day, with a good wind out of the southwest, which were ideal conditions for sailing, at approximately 3 in the afternoon, 2 of the royal ships, Phoenix and Rose, cast off their moorings at Staten Island and started up the harbor until full sail. They moved swiftly with favorable winds in a perfect flood tide. Alarm guns sounded in New York. Soldiers rushed in every direction through the streets with crowded, panic-stricken people. The cannon at Red Hook and Governor's Island opened fire, and as the ships swept by Lower Manhattan, heading into the mouth of the Hudson, the guns at Old Fort George and other shore batteries opened up. Commanding the fire from Fort George was a 19-year-old captain of New York artillery, Alexander Hamilton, who had left King's College to serve the cause. The ships returned fire. Cannonballs slammed into houses and came bounding down streets still swarming with people. Washington would write of the extreme distress he felt at the shrieks and cries of women and children, running every which way, and at the spectacle of his own men standing at water's edge, gawking helplessly, so awestruck or terrified that they were they stricken by the ferocious barrage let loose by the enemy ships. American gun crews had fired nearly 200 shots, more than 150 from the New York batteries alone, and they had no apparent effect. Now, according to the ship's logs, they actually did do a decent bit of damage, but nonetheless, the ships made it. It was a grave realization that Knox's guns had proven more deadly to his own men than to the foe. 6 American artillerymen were killed, the only fatalities of the day, when their cannon blew up due to either their own inexperience or overconfidence, or maybe because, as many said, a great many of them were drunk. In his ensuing general orders, Washington could barely conceal his utter disgust over the inexcusable behavior displayed in the face of the enemy, and the shame that he felt over officers who, instead of attending to their duty, had stood gazing like bumpkins. To the proud Washington, he and the army had been made a laughingstock. His word to the soldiers was, "Such unsoldierly conduct must grieve every good officer and give the enemy a mean opinion of the army, as nothing shows the brave and good soldier more than, in case of alarms, coolly and calmly repairing to his post, and there waiting his orders, whereas a weak curiosity at such a time makes a man look mean and contemptible." And the difference in Washington and the traditional military leadership of the day can be seen right there. In the British Army, that would have been met with whipping or torture, or they could have even been hung. In the Hessian Army, they certainly would have been killed. But Washington, instead of disciplining with harsh discipline, he instead, almost like a football coach, coached them into how to be better men, how to be better soldiers. He had a relationship with these men. And that's one of the most crucial aspects of how Washington led this army. He didn't rely on capital punishment. He didn't rely on brutality. He relied on appealing to the character of each one of his soldiers. And he was really one of the first people to do that in the history of warfare. And that's why he's so special. That's just one of the reasons why he's so special to the entire revolution as a whole. This was the beginning of what is known as the Battle of Long Island. The ships would skirt up the river, and there were some small skirmishes, but it wasn't until later in August that the battle actually started. Washington believed that the major attack would come probably from Manhattan, but he was not sure. He lacked intelligence, and he searched for clues in the conduct of the British troops on Long Island. On the 22nd of August, they moved within 3 miles of American lines. Then they stopped and did not advance for 2 days. That pattern suggested to the leadership of the American army that Long Island was not their major attack, and that the operation was designed to draw American troops away from Manhattan. Washington was racked by doubt and indecision, and he kept the bulk of his troops on Manhattan and held most American troops out of action, expecting the major British attack to fall elsewhere. And his intelligence was not good. He still believed that British commanders were holding back 26,000 men, with as many as 12,000 already embarked on transports ready to strike at another point, and he was sorely mistaken. Howe's army was also suffering from illness and had a little less than 25,000 effective troops, not 35,000 as Washington believed. The British commanders committed nearly all of their army to Long Island, not just 9,000 as the Americans mistakenly thought, but 22,000. And more than 90% of his force was ashore on Long Island, not 25% as Washington had thought. It was a fatal miscalculation by American leaders. And other errors continued to follow in the American camp. Hedging his bets, Washington sent 10 regiments as reinforcements for Long Island and included 2 of his most disciplined units. But then he ordered the commanders of these regiments to remain in New York. Lieutenant Colonel Hermann Zedwitz, a Prussian officer, had been caught attempting to sell American intelligence to British officers for 2,000 pounds. Washington was so outraged by his betrayal that he ordered 13 senior officers, including Hazlitt and Smallwood, to leave their commands and sit as a court-martial on the 25th and 26th of August. And that's when the British attack came. The officers of the Delaware and Maryland regiments desperately wanted to be with their men, but Washington wanted to be done with Colonel Zedwitz. Now, it's understandable that he would want to be done with this spy, but the attack was happening. And Nathaniel Greene was the general who was supposed to be in charge of this Brooklyn Heights defense. And remember, they weren't supposed to hold their posts. They were expected to sell them at a price that the British and Germans just couldn't afford to pay. Greene was so sick that he couldn't even carry out the orders, so Washington decided to change generals one more time. He replaced Greene with Sullivan, and then again with Israel Putnam, who knew Long Island really well, but he had very little knowledge of the American positions. So in 5 days, the American troops at Long Island went through 3 commanders. To make matters worse, right after that, at the same time, Washington's headquarters made the decision to reshuffle its regiments into brigades. So tangled was command and control that units were uncertain about their commanders and not sure of the positions they were to defend. Many of the units just began to move on their own. Sullivan reported that American troops were wandering about western Long Island, sometimes miles beyond their position. Information gathering in Washington's headquarters was so weak that he did not know the movements of his own army. No senior officer knew how many American troops were actually on Long Island or exactly where they were posted. Estimates by historians have ranged from 16 to 31 regiments and between 9,400 and 11,000 men. When Washington returned to Manhattan, he sent a letter to Putnam urging him to get a grip on the army to form a proper line of defense, and he added at the end, quote, "The distinction between a well-regulated army and a mob is the good order and discipline of the first, and the licentious and disorderly behavior of the latter." Currently, the Continental Army looked like the latter. The British poked and prodded the American lines with light cavalry and light infantry, and they were quickly dominating ground between the armies and gaining valuable intel of how the Americans were positioned. They came up with a strategy to divide the British army into 3 forces. Basically, they were going to cut and split the American army into 3 as well, but they would be kind of cut off from each other, and that would be their demise. In the morning, General Grant led his demonstration to the south, and Heister did the same in the center. On the north, Clinton led the major attack behind the American flank. British troops had to cut a path through the woods with saws and axes, and even so, Americans didn't discover them. The British burst out of the woods on the flank, and the American left collapsed. Sullivan was captured. His troops broke and ran. Colonel William Smallwood saw 68 British light infantrymen put to flight 2 Connecticut brigades. Washington and Putnam hurried forward to stop the rout. Smallwood watched in amazement as the American troops, quote, "from the brigadier general down to the private sentinel, were caned and whipped by the generals Washington, Putnam, and Mifflin. But even this indignity had no weight. They could not be brought to stand one shot." On the right, Sterling saw Sullivan's line fall apart, and he ordered a retreat. To cover the withdrawal, he led forward 2 of the best American regiments, Smallwood's Marylanders and Hazlitt's Delaware Continentals. They made a desperate stand in a plowed field and stopped the British advance long enough for other units to get away. Washington watched them and cried, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." Both regiments suffered severely. Colonel Smallwood wrote afterward, quote, "I could wish the transactions of this day blotted from the annals of America. Nothing appeared but fright, disgrace, and confusion." There were pockets of strong resistance. A British observer wrote that some Americans, quote, "more bold, though not more brave, fired as they ran, or as they could find cover from walls and hedges." Altogether, General Howe estimated that he lost 370 men killed and wounded. His casualty counts were always a bit low, but nonetheless 370. An eyewitness on the other side was Ambrose Searle. He wrote that, quote, "the rebels abandoned every spot as fast, I should say faster, than the king's troops advanced upon them. The English, Hessians, and Scottish troops followed and, quote, cut them down in a terrible manner." And although I have spent quite a bit of time talking about how this was a professional army and a gentleman's army, war is war, there was still horrors that were seen and committed on that battlefield. In some cases, the British regulars refused to allow Americans to surrender. An English officer wrote, quote, "The Hessians and our brave Highlanders gave no quarters, and it was a fine sight to see with what alacrity they dispatched the rebels with their bayonets, after we had surrounded them so that they could not resist. We took care to tell the Hessians that the rebels had resolved to give no quarters to them in particular, which made them fight desperately and put to death all who fell into their hands. A Hessian colonel confirmed that, quote, The English did not give much quarter and constantly urged our people to do the like. He went on, "The riflemen were mostly spitted to the trees with bayonets. These people deserve pity rather than fear." The American rebels got little pity that day, and British and German regulars were quick to discover that green American troops had a special fear of the bayonet, the terror weapon of the 18th century. They were a fearful sight if you were there that day, with long blades gleaming in light, and many American troops had no bayonets of their own. So after the battle, Howe issued a general order on the subject. Soldiers are reminded of their evident superiority on the 27th of August by charging the rebels with their bayonets, even in the woods where they had thought themselves invincible. The general therefore recommends to the troops an entire dependence upon their bayonets. As the chase went on, more Americans were allowed to surrender, sometimes an entire unit at a time. But their fate wasn't much better than those who had been murdered on the battlefield. The British command put prisoners to work. Quote, "As long as we had no horses, the prisoners were harnessed in front of the cannon." A Hessian remembered and recalled that, quote, "Among the prisoners were many called colonels, lieutenant colonels, majors, and other officers who, however, are nothing but mechanics, tailors, shoemakers, wig-makers, barbers, etc. Some of them were soundly beaten by our people, who would by no means let such persons pass for officers." The Connecticut regiment of Lieutenant Jabez Fitch was caught between two severe fires and surrounded by Hessian troops. The regiment came apart and many were captured. Fitch was confined in a barn with a great number of prisoners of different regiments. He found himself next to Captain Joseph Jewett, who had a mortal bayonet wound in his abdomen and suffered terribly for 2 days, often repeating, quote, "It was hard work to die." On his last night, he worried for his family and asked his friends to write down the circumstances of his death to his wife. The next morning, Captain Jewett passed away as dawn rose on another cruel day in New York. Altogether, the Americans counted their losses at about 300 killed, 1,097 captured, with no reliable estimates of the wounded. General Howe thought he had inflicted 3,400 casualties. Half that number would be closer to the mark. The plan of the British General Henry Clinton had succeeded brilliantly in a tactical way, but did not achieve its strategic goal of destroying the rebel army. Most of the Americans on the heights of Guana got away. Ambrose Searle wrote of Howe's army, "In one thing only they failed, could not run as fast as their foe." The American army had been routed. Its commanders had made many horrible errors, and even its best infantry could not win a pitched battle against a seasoned regular army. In an ordeal by combat on Long Island, the forces of order made short work for an army of liberty. But some British and Hessian officers were quick to see that something else had happened. The Americans had been driven from the field, but most of them survived to fight another day. Those who talked with American prisoners also reported that even though they had suffered a heavy defeat, they didn't feel defeated. In the eyes of the regulars, the rebels had lost all honor, but many retained their pride and determination even as prisoners, which really irritated them. They believed deeply in their cause and were confident that they would win in the end. It was maddening to these professional soldiers. These American, quote, peasants were so ignorant of war they didn't even know they were beaten. It was clear even to the winners that the Battle of Long Island was only the beginning. With the Americans defeated at the Battle of Long Island, the Howe brothers, the generals of the British, were confident that they had trapped a large part of the American army, they thought up to 10,000 men, on Brooklyn Heights, with the Royal Navy at their rear. The position of the Americans was strong, though, that they had been working on the fortifications for months, and they held a high ground with clear fields of fire with double palisades, trenches, half trenches, redoubts, and a star forts at intervals along the line, and small fortresses at critical points. They had abundant provisions, plenty of ammunition, and a bunch of guns. Some British officers wanted to storm the American lines, but William Howe refused to repeat the error of Bunker Hill. He was not about to risk his highly trained regulars in a frontal assault on a fortified position. Instead, he ordered his military engineers to make regular approaches in siege lines and field redoubts, which the nature of the ground favored extremely, according to Howe. They moved forward methodically and soon discovered weak points in the American lines. While siege operations advanced, the Howe brothers tried an initiative for peace. They released General Sullivan from captivity on the condition that he carry a message to Congress calling for negotiations. American leaders in the Congress and Army had none of it and were not pleased with Sullivan even for delivering the message. The peace feelers were rejected out of hand, in part because of the behavior of the British and Hessian troops at Long Island. Stories were quick to spread of captives who were denied quarter and were shot or bayoneted in cold blood. Other tales began to circulate of prisoners who were severely maltreated. American attitudes were hardening. There was no thought of ending the war. Washington's army would soon be surrounded, and its destruction appeared to be only a matter of time. Then, something happened that seemed small importance to General Howe then, but there was a change in American weather. And this American weather is kind of the theme of Washington's brilliant tactical retreats. There's always a change in weather, and here we have one more. And what Washington found as he rode forward through the positions on Brooklyn Heights, and as he studied the British entrenchments through the driving rain, was that there was such heavy rainfall as can hardly be remembered, according to his own quotes. The siege lines advanced inexorably, protected by folds in the grounds that the Americans had not been able to cover. The next day, in the afternoon of August 29th, Washington called a council of war at the Philip Livingston House. With him were 7 generals from the Brooklyn position: Putnam, Spencer, Mifflin, McDougall, Parsons, J.M. Scott, and Wadsworth. As the rain swept up upon the window panes, Washington posed a question. Should the army evacuate Long Island? He ran through the many reasons for abandoning the position and withdrawing across the East River to Manhattan. The council debated for a long time, and one officer observed that it was a desperate venture. The crossing was a full mile wide, and the current was strong and swift. Boats were in short supply. The British Army could attack at any moment, and the Royal Navy could catch the army on the water. Others thought that it should not be done. The fortifications were very strong. General Putnam observed, based on his experience, that the army would fight well behind entrenchments, and he gave the famous line, quote, "Give an American army a wall to fight behind, and they will fight forever." Nevertheless, Washington ordered that an evacuation was to begin immediately in strictest secrecy. Nobody was to be told. His own men were kept deliberately in the dark. They were just told to pack up and prepare, and to change their positions along the line. At 10 o'clock that night, in the heavy rain, the American units began to withdraw from their line to the water's edge. Colonel Benjamin Talmadge wrote, quote, "It was one of the most anxious, busy nights that I have ever recollected, and being the third in which hardly any of us had closed our eyes to sleep, we were all greatly fatigued." Finally, they were ordered to begin their long crossing of the river. They were ordered to man the boats and keep them moving against the wind and current in the darkness. The nor'easter masked Washington's movements and kept British ships out of the East River, but also delayed the American crossing. At first light, many of the best American troops were still holding their position as a rear guard. Colonel Talmadge's regiment was among them. They knew that when British patrols discovered what had happened, they were doomed to captivity or death, or both, given the barbaric treatment of the prisoners thus far. And then suddenly, again, there was another change in the weather. Talmadge remembered that a, quote, "very dense fog began to rise, and it seemed to settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. It was so thick that Talmadge could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance," according to his own words. New Englanders received this as a providential occurrence. Virginians regarded it as a stroke of fortune. The sun rose, but the fog stayed, and in this strange yellow light, the American army made its escape. And that marks the second occurrence of which Washington was able to, in the night, unbeknownst to the British army, just slip away, just entirely remove an army from combat, one that was surrounded, one that was about to have to surrender, and Washington was again able to just slip away. I cannot imagine the frustration of the brothers Howe, the 2 generals in charge of the British Army, when they woke up and realized they were gone again. I mean, Talmadge even had time to go back and rescue a favorite horse of his. And by the time that he was gone in the water, or by the time the British Army woke up, he was gone in the water well away. I mean, it's an incredible feat of a tactical retreat, and General Washington has never received the credit which was due to him for that amazing retreat again, with the weather to cover him. But with the loss of the Battle of Long Island, there was a lot of soul-searching in the American camp, especially from George Washington. He reported the result to Congress and called a council of the general officers to, quote, take a full and comprehensive view of our situation. In Washington's mind, the problem was to match a strategy to his soldiers that he had on hand. He concluded that it would be folly, quote, to lead our young troops into open ground against their superiors, both in number and discipline. Further, he reported that, quote, I have not found that readiness to defend even strong posts at all hazards. Washington observed that the American troops were not willing to die for honor or duty. Quote, the honor of making a brave defense does not seem to be a sufficient stimulus when the success is very doubtful and the falling into enemy's hands probable. And it was after this realization that Washington came to the conclusion that he was going to wage war with a defensive army rather than an offensive army. And that was a decision that ultimately won the war for the Americans. It had never been done really the way he did it in warfare up to that point. He said that, quote, on our side, the war should be defensive. We should, on all occasions, avoid a general action or put anything to the risk unless compelled by necessity. He resolved to keep his army in being, but it would be a retreating army. A brilliant stroke could be made with any probability of success, Washington said. And it was after that decision that Washington decided not to abandon New York City, but to move all the stores and ammunition and to remove Americans sick by Albany sloops to Orangetown, New York. 3 days later, 7 of Washington's generals asked for another council to reconsider those decisions. They voted to evacuate the city immediately. By the 14th of September, their army was working frantically to save what it could, but they had too many stores, not enough wagons, and very little time. That day, Washington's scouts brought reports of uncommon and formidable movements in the British and Hessian camps. Manhattan was their next target, but where would they strike? Washington was about to find out. He was deceived by another one of General Howe's strategies. While the Americans gathered near Harlem on the northern Manhattan shores, other British ships sailed into the East River on the night of the 14th and 15th of September. They anchored near Kips Bay at the present line of 33rd Street. Standing guard on that shore in what was thought to be a quiet sector were green Connecticut levies. Private Martin remembered, quote, we had a chain of sentinels quite up the river, 4 or 5 miles in length. Every half hour he heard the American sentries repeat their watchwords, all is well. He also heard a British voice in the river call out a reply, quote, we will alter your tune before tomorrow night. That's a pretty ominous thing to hear in the distance in the night. The next morning, Martin awoke to find 5 warships anchored in the river with springs on their cables, gun ports opened, and main batteries run out. He remembered that, quote, it was on a Sabbath morning, the day in which the British were always employed about their devilry if possible. And on the Manhattan shore, Private Martin watched what was coming his way in complete fascination. Quote, when they came to the edge of the tide, they formed their boats in line. Then the frigates opened fire, and Martin remembered that, quote, all of a sudden there came such a peal of thunder from the British shipping that I thought my head would go with the sound. I made a frog's leap for the ditch, and I lay as still as I possibly could, and began to consider which part of my carcass would go first. Wave after wave of British troops came ashore. The light infantry charged the American breastworks to the north. The grenadiers stormed the high hill of Icelandberg. Later it was called Murray Hill. One determined American militiaman stood his ground and shot Mayor Vaughan in the thigh, the only British casualty of the day, said Mackenzie. Then came the Hessians, first a thin screen of green-coated Jaegers, followed by the dense blue ranks of grenadiers. They advanced half a mile south towards the Watts farm, near what is now the 23rd Street of New York, of Brooklyn, and they met stubborn resistance in an orchard and lost 2 killed and 10 wounded. A little beyond, another party of Americans came forward, quote, with an intention of surrendering. A British officer observed that the Hessians killed, quote, about 60 of them and took a few prisoners. It is remarkable that all our killed were shot through the head, which induces the belief that they were first taken prisoner and then massacred. That just goes to show you what brutality that these troops were facing and the difficult morale decisions that Washington was making. He had to somehow motivate an army when you're faced with odds like that. I mean, how can you get amped for battle when you know that this group of men were coming out trying to surrender and they killed them all? They massacred them. Now, there's the phrase, never let a tragedy go to waste, that comes to mind, and I'm sure that they use this for propaganda, whatever the word is. But still, Washington had to deal with people whose enlistments were running up soon, and he had to convince them to stay. That's a job that I wouldn't want to have. And if that wasn't enough, Washington was on the edge of despair. On September 30th, his strength report showed only 14,759 men fit for duty. Half his army had disappeared, and the enemy was, quote, within a stone's throw. He confided to his cousin, Lund Washington, "I was never in such an unhappy, divided state since I was born." He felt that if he could not lead these troops to victory, and yet he was told that, quote, "if I leave the service, all will be lost." Washington was baffled, exhausted, angry, not the least with himself, and he wrote that he was wearied to death all day with a variety of perplexing circumstances. But he was very, very clear on one point, quote, "if the men will stand by me, I am resolved not to be forced from this ground while I have life, and a few days will determine the point." He expected an attack pretty soon where he thought he was going to have to make good on those words, to not move his ground no matter what came from it. And that is the spirit that, even though he was in a despair like he said he had never been since he was born, he was able to forcefully come to the resolution that if these men will be with me, I will be with them. And that was a new thing in military in that day. The British Army, they didn't have that type of loyalty. And the morale of the American riflemen was remarkably high given what they had recently been through. That came from the recent victory at Throgs Neck. It was basically the British on October 8th. The Navy moved up the Hudson River and had stopped Americans from using it. And 3 days after that, they came ashore at Throgs Neck on the mainland, north of Manhattan and about 5 miles from Kingsbridge. It was a major crossing from Manhattan. If they could reach that bridge quickly, they would trap Washington's army. And the commanders made a mistake because they chose that landing site without knowing about the land. They compromised that landing without knowing the ground. When the troops landed on the 12th, they found that Throgs Neck was a marshy island at high tide. The Americans had destroyed the bridge and causeway and had fortified the only good ford. A small force of Edwards, Hand's Pennsylvania riflemen were there again with orders to bring down the British horses. And at Throgs Neck, 30 riflemen stopped the British army in their tracks and then held them there while another 1,500 American infantry hurried to their support, and the British army was stymied. One of the soldiers there wrote, quote, "I suppose they think that movement will induce our army to move further back, but I think they will find themselves much disappointed. Our late retreats were dictated by prudence, not by a dread of their arms." And that's really what sums up Washington's military experience, was beautifully timed and ingeniously executed retreats, strategic retreats that ultimately won the war. And not only those retreats, but the American army was growing just like General Washington was growing in his leadership. At Pell's Point, just a day or two later, General Baldwin and General Glover watched the British force approach and counted 200 sails of enemy ships in 4 divisions. Their first thought was to send a letter to Charles Lee asking for advice. Quote, "I would have given 1,000 worlds to have had General Lee or some other experienced officer present," he recalled. But the British were ashore before an answer came. Glover and Baldwin improvised, and improvisation is really a key characteristic of today's American army, but it started with Washington. Their position was strong. The only way off the beach was by a narrow road through small fields lined with stone walls. The American commanders placed their regiments in echelon one behind the other, protected by the stone walls and very rough ground. The men were ordered to lie down until the British troops came within range, then to rise and fire volleys as fast as they could and fall back behind the other regiments, using the walls for cover. In the first exchange, the British troops received a withering fire, saw the Americans retreating, and went running after them with their bayonets, only to have another American line rise up in their faces. The British and Hessians totaled, suffered about 200 killed and many more wounded than they had lost on Long Island. The stubborn resistance allowed Washington to withdraw his troops north of the hills of White Plains. It also demonstrated the surprising stamina of the American troops. Even if they couldn't defeat the regulars at their own game, they were learning that they could win the war in other ways. Many British and Hessian accounts testified that the American troops were learning from their defeats. Lieutenant Bartleben, wrote that, quote, "The rebels had excellent positions at White Plains. They had made their defenses better than usual and maintained their posts with extraordinary tenacity. The defeated Americans retreated in good order. The victorious British and Hessians gained the field, but returned to Manhattan with the feeling that something had just kind of gone wrong." And now remember back to when I said that Washington had written that he was in despair like he had never been before. Remember that point, because it was shortly after that, or before that, I guess, that when he was watching these men retreat, he was smacking the officers with his hat, cursing at them, and out loud saying, like, "What kind of troops do I have?" Stuff like that. What's coming is another defeat for Washington, but the way he handled it shows just the growth in a few days and how he realized that this army is what he has. They have to do the best they can with it. And it was General Howe that took his army back to Manhattan after that defeat at Throgs Neck to deal with the last remaining troops there, the garrison at Fort Washington. This is the one that they had spent a ton of time building up, and it was actually highly vulnerable. A British officer observed that the fortifications were too extensive for the number of troops. They couldn't even keep ships from going up and down the Hudson. And this upcoming battle might have been better for Washington. It might have been defendable, but on the night of November 2nd, a man named William de Monts snuck out of the fort and delivered its plans to the British commanders, along with a lot of helpful information about the intentions of the Americans, their strengths, and their weaknesses of their defenses. The British officer who interrogated him reported that great dissensions in the rebel army, everybody finding fault with the mode of proceeding, and the inferior officers, even ensigns, insisting that in such a cause every man has a right to assist in council and to give his opinion. And it's interesting that that is what he noticed of all of that man's testimony, was that every man has the right to assist in council, because that was something Washington had centered his army around, and it was something that ultimately won the war. But in this case, they thought it was incredibly peculiar. At daybreak, Howe's army launched their assault. British troops attacked in boats across the Harlem River, and 4,000 Hessians stormed the fort on its landward side. The fighting was heavy where the Hessians met a large force of riflemen, and the German troops suffered many, many casualties. Inexorably, the defenders were driven from the outer works into the central part of the fort, which became untenable, and the American commander surrendered. Some defenders were denied quarter. General Mackenzie wrote, quote, "The Hessians were extremely irritated at having lost a good many men in the attack, and they killed some of the riflemen after surrender until officers intervened to stop the slaughter. More than 2,800 American troops were lost, almost all of them to the cruel captivity in the prison hulks of that harbor, and the murder and massacre of the Hessian troops." General Nathaniel Greene was crushed by his error in recommending that the fort be held, and he wrote, quote, "I feel mad, vexed, sick, and sorry. This is a most terrible event. Its consequences are justly to be dreaded." George Washington himself was shattered by the event. He was a witness to the final scenes, looking on helplessly from the Jersey Palisades across the river. Through his telescope, he could see some of the troops fighting bravely, only to be driven back and defeated. The worst of it all was to watch them surrender and see some of them put to the sword. This time, there was no expression of anger by the American commander-in-chief. He blamed no one else for what had happened. He took all the responsibility on his own shoulders and judged himself more severely than anyone else could judge him. As the full weight of that disaster fell upon him, he turned away from his lieutenants and he began to weep. One witness was there said he wept, quote, with the tenderness of a child. His aides didn't know how to help, or even if they should. Some were beginning to doubt that he could lead them. Joseph Reed wrote afterwards, quote, he hesitated more than I ever knew him on any other occasion, and more than I thought the public service admitted. Charles Lee wrote in sadness, "O General, an indecisive mind is one of the greatest misfortunes that can befall an army. It was the absolute lowest point of Washington's very long career. In the agony of that moment, he felt he had lost everything, lost the war, lost the cause, lost his own way. But then, this extraordinary man that George Washington was, he reached deep into his last reserves of inner strength. Not a whole lot was left, but enough to shake off a terrible despair. He looked away from Fort Washington and rallied his aides around him. Together, they would try again." And that marks the end of the New York campaign. It was one that was mired with failure. I mean, there's no other word to say it. It was just a massive, massive failure for George Washington. And this was what I talked about at the beginning, I believe it was the last episode, where I asked if you were failing at everything and then you finally broke down and wept, how long do you think you would still be employed? And it's an American miracle, we'll say that. It's a miracle that George Washington was able to gain control again. He basically studied his choices. He gave a ton of attention to intelligence with more success than ever before. And as the British Army occupied more territory, Washington gained sources of information. He would interrogate prisoners. He learned from the interrogation of a British deserter that flat-bottom landing craft were being brought through the Harlem River for a crossing of the Hudson into New Jersey. That same day, Washington began to move his army across the Hudson River in preparations for the attack. In his mind, this movement was not a retreat, but a shift of front. He went into New Jersey to protect that state from attack, and that he would do. Now, to lead the British conquest of New Jersey, General Howe selected one of his finest officers, Charles Cornwallis, and it was his first independent command. Cornwallis was under orders to not attack General Washington, which was odd, but they were also suffering from a lack of supplies and very wearied and battered men. They wanted to basically take New Jersey as a camp for the winter. That's what the Howe brothers had in mind for New Jersey and for Cornwallis. So Cornwallis chased Washington all the way through New Jersey, and finally they had them, what Washington feared was trapped at the Delaware River. And Cornwallis let them go, per his orders. The Hessian troops were pretty furious about this, as one could imagine. One of them wrote something to the effect that we chased them all the way to show that the generals had calculated the exact moment that the Americans needed to escape, basically saying they knew what they were doing the whole time. Why weren't we going to get them? And when they crossed the Delaware, the American army, word came out in Philadelphia that the Redcoats were that close, and pandemonium broke out. The citizens began to just panic. Martial law was ordered. A lot of the locals who were loyal to American causes abandoned that cause and went with the British. A lot of the people decided that their best case was to flee. So Washington was camped out. He had no troops. They were leaving by the hundreds when their enlistments ran up. He had no money, and he had desperately short arms. And then something incredible happened, and this was out of Washington's control. Thomas Paine, who wrote the Common Sense pamphlet, wrote one more, and it was called The American Crisis. And this pamphlet this pamphlet was more than an exhortation. It was a program for action. Thomas Paine laid out the broad agenda for Congress and the states, for the army and militia, for merchants and farmers, and for Americans who were still free, and others who were under the heel of a foreign conqueror. Most importantly, he concentrated the mind of a nation on the single most urgent task, which was to rebuild its army and do it quickly. Thomas Paine called it the December Crisis, and he says it was critical in more senses than one. Everyone agreed that it was a perilous moment when things had gone deeply wrong for the American War of Independence. It was also a pivotal moment when great issues of the Revolution were hanging in the balance. Most of all, it was a moment of decision. Thanks in part to Thomas Paine, it became a time when many Americans resolved to act in ways that made a difference in the entire world. An important part of this revival happened in Congress. In Congress, the disasters of the New York campaign persuaded the members of that Congress to make a change in the direction of the war. For months they had thought that their duty was to manage the details of it themselves, and their intervention had driven the generals wild with frustration. On December 12th, they agreed to change their ways and passed a resolution that would give Washington ultimate command of the army. He was basically given the Department of War for a 6-month term, and he was always to be held accountable to Congress. A lot of people in the colonies at that time decried it as Washington was given a dictatorship. And to be fair, in modern history, that's the way most ways have gone. The army could either become a state, it could become a tool of a tyrannist. In a communist, fascist era, it would become a state of its own. But America went a different way with it, and it's amazing that they did. They took it into a direction that basically ensured civil control with the Army's direction. And George Washington was incredibly cautious to always hold accountable his own actions to Congress. He asked permission first, and when Congress delayed, for example, in creating an artillery corps, he notified them on December 21st, I want to say, that he was just going to go ahead and do it himself. But he always was careful to say what he was doing and why. And it was the first time that this had ever happened in the history of humankind. And it was incredible. And all that change came from Thomas Paine and the words that he wrote and fired up that revival. It was a revival that grew from defeat, not from victory. The awakening was a response to a disaster. Dr. Benjamin Rush, who had a major role in the event, believed that this was the way a free republic would always work, in the American Republic in particular. He thought it was a national habit of the American people not to deal with a difficult problem until it was nearly impossible. He wrote, quote, "Our republics cannot exist long in prosperity. We require adversity and appear to possess most of the Republican spirit when we are most depressed." Now, regardless of the validity of his statements, which were all just an expansion and a very eloquent echo of the sentiments shared by the Americans at this time, what Paine did was manage to provide just enough spark of life into the army, the people, and, for all intents and purposes, Washington himself. It could not have come at a more crucial point in history, as he was about to find out. Washington and his army were in a serious situation, and he had a plan to lead his men in what many historians of this era considered the most bold and audacious attack an army has ever attempted. The plan was to cross the Delaware River and to attack the Hessian force camped at Trenton, New Jersey. It was an elaborate scheme concocted by Washington in order to both gain momentum tactically as well as gain momentum for the independence in the eyes of the American people. Now, this Hessian force was led by Colonel Rall, that's R-A-L-L, he's German, and he was in Trenton for the winter. Contrary to popular beliefs, however, Rall was actually expecting an attack, and a sizable one at that. This was because of months, I shouldn't say months, but weeks of Americans picking up more and more local townspeople as committed soldiers. That was in no small part because of Thomas Paine's timely reinvigoration of the people towards the cause. Many were taking it upon themselves to harass the enemy troops as often as possible, to the point that Rall had his men patrolling each night. He had 7 layers of outposts. ready for either an army or a group of local militia to pick off a few of his men or steal some supply wagons and retreat into the wooded cover that darkness offered. Rawle and his men had just chased Washington and his entire army across an entire state, the entire state of New Jersey, in the winter, and they were tired. This is one thing that makes Washington's attack even more amazing. The fact that Rawle was expecting something to happen and Washington was still able to plan an attack that would achieve total military surprise. One thing to keep in mind as I go through this last part of this episode and the whole series really is that this was during the winter. This was on Christmas Day that the American camps along the Delaware River began to stir in clouds of smoke from kitchen fires where the women of the army were cooking because the men had orders to prepare 3 days rations ready cooked. This was Christmas Day. It was New Jersey. It was cold. It was really cold. The ground was white with frozen snow. For much of the morning, the sun warmed the air a little, but temperatures stayed below freezing. So Washington gave the order on Christmas morning to basically have the troops form up. And the reason he chose Christmas morning, he actually sat down to write a letter that morning to, let me double check to who it was. He was writing to his friend Robert Morris, who was in Philadelphia. And basically they had intercepted a communication that said that the British were planning to cross the Delaware as soon as the ice was frozen and sufficiently strong for an army to get across it. Washington warned Robert Morris that, quote, "I mention this that you may take the necessary steps for the security of such public and private property as ought not to fall into their hands should they make themselves masters of Philadelphia." And what he meant by that was basically, without saying it, he said, if this attack fails, which Robert Morris didn't know about at the time, if this attack fails, you get ready because this is it. We'll be done. It's a pretty somber realization, I would imagine, as a general. The mood of the letter was dark, but it was very determined. He continued as if he were joking to himself, "It is vain to ruminate upon or even reflect upon the authors or causes of our present misfortunes. We should rather exert ourselves to look forward with hopes that some lucky chance may yet turn up in our favor." And of course he had luck. It's the story of his entire career. At the end of the page, he dropped his accustomed mask of confidence and added, kind of with a grim tone, quote, "I hope the next Christmas will prove happier than the present to you and to dear sir, your sincere friend and humble servant." So it wasn't the best of times, but it wasn't the worst of times. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, American drums began to beat and call the men to arms. John Greenwood was a fifer in the army. He was attached to Washington's unit, actually, and he remembers that every man in his regiment was ordered to carry a musket, even the officers and the musicians such as himself. He recalled, quote, "I then had a gun, as indeed every officer had. They were all given as much ammo as they could carry as well." Greenwood wrote that, quote, "None but the first officers knew where we were going or what we were going about, for it was a secret expedition." And there's 2 things to point out about that is, first, that Washington was able to have the wherewithal to plan this thing without really telling anyone else because he had trouble with spies, as all armies do, but he had particularly high-ranking spies recently. And secondly, the mood of the soldiers was still so positive, and they had no idea where they were going. Greenwood writes, quote, "I never heard soldiers say anything, nor ever saw them trouble themselves as to where they were or where they were led. It was enough for them to know that wherever the officers commanded they must go, be it through fire and water. Owing to the impossibility of being in a worse condition than their present one, the men always liked to be kept moving in the expectation of bettering themselves. Even after everything that had happened to them, they continued to be these optimistic fatalists that believed that any change was for the best. And again, they were okay to just follow their officers. And these officers were under orders from Washington to remain fixed in their divisions, basically to be as tight as possible, and to have a white paper in their hats to be distinguished by. And this is a custom that has endured in the U.S. Army from the banks of this battle on the Delaware to the coast of Normandy. Officers and non-coms had white stripes painted on the backs of their helmets. This was a sign for men to follow their leaders and a signal to the officers that they were there to lead from the front, not the rear. This is a humongous thing in military. Up until this point, the officers stayed in the back and they directed the battle. This was the first time where basically the men were supposed to follow their leaders. Washington himself and his veteran Continental regiments were to cross at McConkey's and Johnson's ferries about 10 miles upstream from Trenton, and they would attack the town from the north and west. A smaller force led by James Ewing, he had about 800 militia from rural Pennsylvania were to cross the river at Trenton Ferry just south, and their mission was to seize and hold a bridge across Assunpink Creek and block the only exit from the town to the southeast. A third force down the river had another assignment, and that was under Colonel Daniel Hitchcock, and they were ordered to embark near Bristol in Pennsylvania and to land at Burlington in New Jersey, about 12 miles below Trenton. Their mission was to draw the attention of the brigade of Hessian grenadiers and another group of Highlanders and keep them occupied. Washington wrote to Colonel Cadwallader, I don't know how to say his name, I'm sorry, might be a general even. He said, quote, "If you can do nothing real, at least create as great a diversion as possible." And I've just always loved those orders. I just think that's such a great, I don't know, that's just me being weird probably, but no sooner had these forces mustered on Christmas afternoon, Washington's schedule began to just fall apart. The old army saying that no battle plan survives contact with the enemy is only half correct. Most plans don't even survive contact with friendlies. And Washington's entire operation was vital upon time. It was just the sole factor that was vital to the success of the entire operation. He figured that his troops at the upstream crossing had to march about 10 miles in New Jersey to Trenton, and to achieve surprise, he wanted to attack the town before dawn at 5 o'clock in the morning. That plan would only work if the army began to cross the Delaware just after dark and assembled in New Jersey ready to march no later than midnight. So a pretty tight schedule, and that's not even counting the weather and the massive amount of artillery that they brought with them. The first of these time-critical events was one group of his army that was coming from Newtown, Pennsylvania, which was 5 miles from their crossing. A lot of them were ill, and more than a few of the men were without shoes. Major James Wilkinson followed their trail from Newtown to the river and remembered that the route, as he said, quote, was easily traced as there was little snow on the ground, which was tinged here and there with the blood from the feet of the men who wore broken shoes. I say that to just remind you that these guys were pretty bad off. This was not a well-fed, well-clothed army. Delays up and down the river because of the weather and the ice, even before they reached the west bank of the river, they were more than 2 hours late. Washington was pretty deeply concerned. A 2-hour delay meant an attack in daylight, which made tactical surprise very doubtful and put the entire mission at risk. And the last thing that really slowed down the army was a blessing in disguise, it turned out to be, but as Nathaniel Greenwood wrote, it began to drizzle or grow wet by the time they reached the river. The drizzle had become a driving rain. About 11 o'clock, a howling nor'easter hit them with terrific force. Greenwood remembered that, quote, it hailed, snowed, rained, and froze. I think the only thing he forgot to mention was the sleet. The wind rose so high, he said, it blew a perfect hurricane. And all this happened as they gathered at the river. Now, of course, if you've been paying any attention, you would expect that Washington would get some type of weather because that always happened with him. This was the weather, it seemed, that was going on right then, and it almost canceled the attack before it even began. But nevertheless, they went ahead with the crossing. Now, one thing, again, that is contrary to popular opinion, and that's mainly due to the famous crossing of the Delaware painting, it wasn't that smooth. I mean, they were doing this at midnight, their plan, and the ice and the current, the wind, rain, and sleet and snow was so thick that one entire group in the south, they had to call off their crossing. They couldn't even do it. Thomas Rodney remembered that, quote, when we reached the Jersey shore, we were obliged to land on the ice 150 yards from the shore. His light infantry struggled across the ice on foot, and Rodney himself figured about 600 of the light troops got over, but the boats with the artillery were carried away in the ice and they could not be reclaimed. By midnight, the entire operation was on the verge of disaster. Of Washington's 3 forces, 2 were defeated by ice on the river. Only the northern force remained at McConkey's Ferry, but there, the boats that they had gathered, the boats that had been gathered for them, that Washington sent orders ahead of them to get, they were all there, they were all lined up, and they were perfect. And that's one of the first things that really changed the tone of this attack for Washington. All these boats were just the most perfect boats you could have asked for to cross this river in these conditions with these men and all the artillery that they brought. And that was the beginning of the plan going right. Now, in today's world where most people can swim, if you're listening to the story, other than the bitter cold of falling into the water, it doesn't sound like that big an ordeal, but you have to remember it was a huge challenge to get the infantry safely across the river. The great majority of the army, like any other population in 18th century America and Europe, were unable to swim a single stroke. Soldiers joked that they did not fear drowning because they were born to hang anyways. In the course of the crossing, some of the men tumbled into the icy water, and one of them was Delaware's Colonel John Hazlitt. He was fished out just in the nick of time, suffering from exposure. This man, he then marched 10 miles on severely swollen legs and fought a battle without a single complaint. Man, I hope I can be half the man that guy was. I mean, 10 miles with hypothermia, fought a battle, didn't complain at all, probably didn't have any shoes either. So all that to say, this crossing was incredibly treacherous. It could have destroyed the army on its own. And if the men weren't difficult enough, they had a very impressive amount of artillery that Colonel Knox was bringing over, and he managed to bring over every single gun without losing a single soldier or a single piece of artillery, which was an impressive feat on its own. So the assembly of the army on the Jersey shore went slowly, but really without a major hitch. Washington's primary concern was to protect the secrecy of this entire operation. He ordered Adam Stevens' Virginia Brigade to move quickly inland and, quote, form a chain of sentries round the landing place at a sufficient distance from the river to permit troops to form. They were told not to suffer any person to go in or come out, but to detain all persons who attempts either. Washington had selected a secret password, and he wrote it himself on small slips of paper for every unit in the army. Benjamin Rush visited him the night before the crossing, and he wrote in his diary, quote, "While I was talking to him, I observed him to play with his pen and ink upon several small pieces of paper. One of them by accident fell upon the floor near my feet. I was struck with the inscription upon it. It was, quote, 'Victory or Death.'" And I can't think of a more fitting password from General George Washington in the story of America at all. Victory or death. And that's really the story of this entire, this whole story's been coming to this point of Washington's crossing and victory or death for the American army and the cause. Now, I've mentioned the artillery in this battle several times, and it's because it was truly a vital element, and because of that iconic painting, most people assume it was mostly just infantry that went over. And the popular notion is that we went over, Washington crossed the river on Christmas while the Hessians were drunk, and we kind of just murdered them in the night and slipped away. Hell yeah, America. That's not at all how it actually happened. The Hessians were actually not drunk at all. That's folklore. Greenwood writes in his own diary that he swears to it, not a single man was drunk. The only men who were drunk that night were actually some of Washington's troops when they found some rum and drank it after the battle. The Hessians were prepared. They were waiting for him, and there was a big battle. It was the Battle of Trenton. Now, a vital element of this battle was artillery, like I was saying. American leaders planned to deploy it on a humongous scale. The standard practice in European armies during the 18th century was to use 2 or 3 battalion guns for every 1,000 infantry. The American force advanced on Trenton with 7 or 8 guns for every 1,000. It's a pretty large proportion. Altogether, Henry Knox brought over 18 guns across the river, and with his normal audacity, he intended to add even more by taking them from the enemy. On his orders, the leading American units, including a, quote, detachment of the artillery without cannon. And these were men who would go into the battle armed with drag ropes, handspikes, and hammers. Must have been some crazy individuals. Their orders were to seize the Hessian cannon at the start of the battle and turn it against the enemy. If that plan failed, their job was to disable the Hessian guns by driving iron handspikes into these touch holes and breaking them flush with the gun tube. And this method it was called spiking. If it was carefully done, it could prevent a gun from being fired until a very skilled blacksmith could drill out the holes, and it was a pretty time-consuming operation. The American leaders intended to use their guns as shock weapons against the enemy and supporting arms for their own infantry. And this shock weapon type of artillery is really the first modern use of artillery, where you're shelling them so hard you're putting them into shock. I mean, that's really the only way to describe it. And the fact that they had so much artillery that they managed to drag with them, because remember, these men just had to drag them with ropes. They drug it to the river, crossed the very dangerous crossing without losing a single piece, and then they had to march 10 miles with it. And remember, I don't know why I say remember, none of you were there, but a 6-pound cannon could weigh, on the light end, 1,750 pounds. That's just for the barrel and carriage alone. More than a ton with the side boxes and ammunition and trail boxes for all the other equipment. In the field, guns were a great strength, but on the march, they were a humongous impediment for a mobile army, and this was pretty much the most mobile that they could possibly be. In the end, it was nearly 4 o'clock in the morning when the American army began to march. So this mission was now 4 hours behind schedule. The road surfaces that they were marching on were so bad, the men would walk on the shoulders, or the entire column with guns, horses, wagons. They would all walk on the shoulders, and that entire column stretched more than a mile. At its head were mounted men in plain farmer's habit, it was written, which basically were local guides who offered their services. The reports of the crossing, they spread quickly across the countryside, and many New Jersey men joined the army as volunteers as they marched by. That was that kind of reinvigoration of that spirit. Now, the weather while they were marching was remembered as more violent on the march than it had been during the crossing. So the weather continued to pick up, and it did not look good at all. But ultimately, of course, because it's weather in Washington, it ended up playing a humongous role in favor of George Washington. And I think it's well-deserved that he got that little favor from the weather gods, because this was the battle that he was in the front the entire time. While they were marching, this story I love. George Washington was riding up and down the column, urging his men forward. There was a very steep ravine. It took him about an hour to cross that with all that artillery. And, it was a muddy road and everything. And suddenly Washington's horse slipped, and it started to fall on a very steep and icy slope. And this is a first-hand account. Quote, while passing a slanting, slippery bank, His Excellency's horse, I don't like that he called him Excellency, but that's how they viewed Washington, as their savior. His Excellency's horse's hind feet both slipped from under him. And so this animal is about to go down. Elijah, I'm not sure, this old spelling is hard to pronounce sometimes, my apologies, but Elijah Bostwick watched in fascination as Washington was able to lock his fingers into the animal's mane, haul up its heavy head by brute force, and shifting his balance backward just enough to allow the horse to regain its hind footing on that treacherous road. Bostwick wrote that the general, quote, seized his horse's mane and the horse recovered. This was an extraordinary feat of strength and skill and timing, and just one more reason why his soldiers just stood in total awe of the man. And that's why they were willing to go and march with a positive mood and follow Washington, because he was basically a god among men to these soldiers, and he led the army by example. George Washington is credited a lot for how modern militaries operate, because he was one of the first people to come up with a lot of these tactics. For instance, because time was such a critical factor, Captain William Hull of the 7th Connecticut Regiment remembered that, quote, the general gave orders that every officer's watch should be set by his, and the moment of the attack fixed. And they all pulled out their big pocket watches and matched them to General Washington's. And this is the very first recorded instance of synchronized watches in a military campaign in the history of time, if you will. When they were halted in doing that, one of the men came up and he basically discovered that even the best and most thoroughly wrapped firearms were wet and not in firing condition. Snow and sleet had melted into their cartridge boxes. The powder was all wet, and this was just kind of passing up and down through the chain of command and everything. And General Sullivan, one of Washington's generals, asked, what is to be done? And Arthur St. Clair, another one of the generals, replied, you have nothing for it but to push on and charge. And then Washington kind of just looked around and he just said, advance and charge. And that was the moment where Washington decided all or nothing, advance and charge. And within a few minutes, they were off marching again. So these men were shoeless, most of them. Some of them are even naked. Clothes had just withered off. They had guns, but they were pretty much useless, so they just fixed bayonets and were prepared to charge. I mean, the amount of dedication to your cause and trust for your leaders that is involved in that is mind-boggling. Lieutenant Monroe met a Jersey man who came out to see why his dogs were barking as they were marching by, and he remembered that the man thought they were from a British army, and he tried to shoo him off, and he was violent and determined, and it goes to show you the treatment of the British and Hessian, mainly the Hessians, the cruelty when they were occupying a state. Presently, they had New Jersey, and they raped their way through that state, and the Hessians would plunder and burn and loot, and the locals did not like them. That's one of the reasons that the locals were flocking to General Washington's cause overnight. Monroe told this man to go back into his home or be taken prisoner, and when the man realized he was talking to American troops, his demeanor changed, and he brought them food and offered to join them. I'm a doctor, he explained, and I may be of help to some poor fellow. And the officers accepted, and Dr. John Riker joined Monroe's infantry as a surgeon volunteer. I mean, that's how passionate these people were about this cause. It's just, he thought in 1 minute, he thought they were the enemy. The next minute, he is marching with them. He as soon as he finds out it's Americans, oh, all right, let's go. Let's do this. Where do you need me? And I just think that's incredible. In this army, trusting its leader and following its leader, because George Washington was always in the front, they continued to march all the way until they were just outside the town of Trenton. It was daylight at this point, but that nasty, nasty storm masked their approach entirely. So the weather started out as an enemy, and it became a friend because they were able to achieve perfect military surprise. Washington was very well informed about the German positions in Trenton, and his intelligence was excellent this day. After just a campaign of terrible intelligence in the New York campaign, this couldn't have been any more different. Washington halted the American left wing on the Pennington Road, which is one of the roads there, behind basically a screen of thick woods. And they were about 800 yards from the Hessian guardhouse, and they were about to make the attack. And the first Hessians that they came across were in a guardhouse, and there weren't very many of them, maybe 15 to 20 in this it's called a Cooper house. Washington surveyed the situation, looked at his watch. It was a little past 8 o'clock in the morning, and George Washington himself led the attack in the center and led the charge. And I think that's just so, at the time it was so revolutionary, if you can pardon that pun, but the leading commander of an army did not do that. 3 minutes after he started his charge, the heavy, heavy boom of American artillery was heard from the Lower River Road. In the center of the town, German kettle drums suddenly began to beat an urgent call to arms, and basically that meant all three attacks, to Washington's amazement, they attacked at the same exact moment through all that snow that masked their approach. Against all expectations, they had taken the Hessians by complete surprise. Now, not only did they achieve surprise on the Hessians, but the Hessians were surprised even during the attack. John Stark was the leader of one of these groups, and he had a reputation as a fighter. He was devoted to the revolutionary cause, and he wrote his wife that he was determined to, quote, live free or die, a phrase that his state later made its motto. Stark had trained in his New Hampshire militia. He had trained those men to use their bayonet, and he led them forward, again, the officers leading the attack, through the fields along the river road, and the Hessians were amazed to see these American rebels whom they despised because they considered them cowards. They considered them not in this chivalric type of army view that they held battle like knights. They despised Americans. They were astonished to see them running towards them with fixed bayonets. And the lieutenant that was in front of this attack immediately ordered his men to fall back. They didn't know what to do. As the Hessians retreated towards Trenton, the Americans launched another part of their attack, which was massed artillery on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, began firing into the town. Now that part of the battle doesn't appear in most American accounts, but Hessians remember it very, very well, and they testify that they came under heavy fire from 7 batteries across the river. Solid cannon shot would smash the ice along the waterfront, and shells from howitzers on the other side of the Delaware exploded around the Hessian positions. German troops near the water's edge were forced to leave their posts on account of the cannonade, as all of them would write, and Trenton was now under heavy attack from all 3 sides. In the center of the town, there were 3 Hessian regiments. They came running out of their quarters at the first sound of firing at these outposts. And this is the point I was trying to get at earlier, is that they were alert and they responded quickly to the attack. The Boston fifer, John Greenwood, I think I said Nathaniel or Nathan Greenwood earlier, my apologies, this is John Greenwood, and he was there, and he wrote later in his memoir that he could swear to it, he could guarantee the only men that were drunk were the Americans after they found the rum after the battle. These Germans were surprised militarily, but they were alert and ready to fight, not as folklore would suggest that we assassinated them in their sleep, as badass a story as that is. I almost think that the truth of what happened is even more badass, because as the men approached the upper part of the town from the north, Washington was in the lead again, and he was the first one to meet them, sword drawn, I'm sure, on horseback. The American troops were running forward in open order through the snow. Colonel Clement Biddle wrote, "Indeed, I never could conceive that one spirit should so universally animate both officers and men to rush forward into action." It's just unbelievable how much Washington was able to inspire his troops. Where was this Washington in New York? He had finally gained some confidence. All these things had come into play, and this is the fruition of all of that, just combining in this man to create this extraordinary feat of leadership and American ingenuity. And it was that ingenuity and American spirit that won them this battle, partly because of the American artillery. It just straight overpowered these Hessian guns and laid down a concentration of fire at the vital center of the battle. Solid iron shot was just bounding down, the main drag towards their artillery. It was written that 5 horses were hit and were terribly wounded in the street. 8 Hessian gunners went down. The rest were driven away by guns with grape shot and by heavy musketry from the American infantry, who were firing from houses on their flank. The German artillerymen remembered that American musketry was even more destructive than the batteries on the hill. A lot of that is due to the Americans understanding that they needed to get indoors, probably wanted to because of the cold, but that was able to dry out their powder and their weapons to actually be able to fire. A lot of these Hessians couldn't fire back because they were outside and their guns were wet. Now, this entire battle was just an example of George Washington on he could not have done a better job. During the battle, he retreated to the high ground where he could overlook things because he was a general and he was directing his army. and he saw a couple Hessian regiments rally in this apple orchard nearby, and he watched them start up the hill towards his flank. Now, with great speed because they're marching towards him, and with, a stable mind, he instantly sent an order for a Pennsylvania Rifle Regiment, two of them, to shift to the east beyond the Hessians who were advancing up the hill towards the Americans. He included in the orders to act with, quote, spirit and rapidity. They moved quickly beyond the Princeton Road, and they formed a line on the higher ground with a clear field of fire. And that counterstroke defeated that Hessian plan. If Colonel Rall, who was the leader of the Hessian regiment there, had led his men forward to strike at what had been Washington's flank, the American regiments beyond the Princeton Road would now be on his flank, and the German troops would be caught between two fires. Washington's quick reaction basically checkmated Colonel Rall's advance just as it was getting underway. Now, earlier in this battle, when the artillery was basically firing at each other, the Hessians had to abandon two of their guns because they were just overwhelmed. And the Hessians, as proud as they were, basically were given orders to go get those guns back. And they did. A lot of them died doing it because they were just charging. It was a suicide mission. This is just another story of Washington requisitioning those guns and using them against them, but leading from the front. Again, Colonel Henry Knox, the artillery mastermind, he looked towards their artillery and he just said, "My brave lads, go up and take those two held pieces, sword in hand. There's a party going, and you must join them." I mean, this guy just loved he was made for war. They kind of looked around at each other, and another captain said, "You heard what the colonel said, Sergeant White. Now take your men and join the others in the attack." And these were artillery guys. They weren't like hand-to-hand combat fighters, but sure enough, they did it because, quote, Captain Washington rushed forward, attacked, and put the troops around the cannon to flight and took possession of them. I mean, it's just the leadership of this battle is something that has been studied for many, many years. And it's amazing that Washington was not shot or injured at all. It's just purely amazing because if you're at the front of that, you're the only target. And somehow he managed to skirt around all disaster for himself and for the country, really. In fact, the Americans didn't really suffer many casualties during this battle at all. The German troops, they suffered quite the opposite. They suffered a lot, killed and wounded and captured. The Lossberg Regiment, they lost 70 men in this battle. The American infantry were aiming at Hessian officers and brought down 4 of their captains. Colonel Rall himself passed away from this. I shouldn't say passed away. He died from his wounds. Another junior officer went down. Rall turned to console him, and the colonel was hit and reeled in his saddle, according to accounts. He was shot twice in his side. Both of those wounds were mortal, and the dying German commander was helped off his horse, carried into the church, and laid upon a bench where he would eventually die. In the center of Trenton, the battle became a bedlam of sound. The streets echoed with thunder of artillery, the crash of iron, brick, stone, just splintering wood, shattering glass, roar of muskets firing, steel against steel, because remember it was hand to hand, mingled shouts and cursing at each other, and the cries of wounded men on the street. On the vast scale of human slaughter, this 18th century battle, it wasn't much to compare to, like, let's say Normandy, but it was close. It was close combat and cold steel. It massed all the muskets and the cannons at point blank range. They created this scene of 18th century horror beyond imagining. The Americans themselves were appalled by the carnage that they had caused. Henry Knox, the artillery mastermind, wrote, quote, "Here succeeded a scene of war which I had often conceived but never saw before. The hurry, fright, and confusion of the enemy was unlike that which will be when the last trump shall sound." Sergeant Joseph White, he felt the same way, quote, "My blood chilled to see such horror and distress, blood mingling together, the dying groans, and garments rolled in blood. The sight was too much to bear." After the dust settled, Greenwood's regiment, our fifer that we've been following, he passed through the area where the fighting had been most severe, and he wrote that he passed 2 of their cannons, brass 6-pounders, by the side of which lay 7 dead Hessians and a brass drum. He was pretty curious about that drum. He was a musician, and he stopped to look at it, but he was quickly distracted because out of nowhere, he wrote that, quote, General Washington, on horseback and alone, came up to our major and said, "March on, my brave fellows, after me," and then just rode off. And most of the American soldiers that were involved in this battle shared that memory of Washington just like on this, what almost seemed like a cocaine-fueled war binge where he was just all over the place, but he was doing everything perfectly and correctly and quickly, and somehow he just didn't get hit. I mean, it's mind-boggling. I'm still trying to get over it right now, and I've read the story 100 times. And what I'm getting at is these men, they saw Washington as their leader. They saw him as the spirit of the revolution, but they also saw him as their comrade in arms, because time and time again, he was in the middle of the battle with them. This was not some like fat bureaucrat sending the young off to die. He was right there in the thick of it. And that was one of the most audacious and bold and inspiring moves that any general has ever made with his troops, especially in that day and age. When the dust of the battle had settled and it was all over, the Americans had won their most decisive victory to date in that war. Altogether, the Hessians lost 918 men. The Americans captured 896 officers and men, including the wounded, and, quote, as many muskets, bayonets, cartridge boxes, and swords. They seized enough material to equip several American brigades. Most prized by the victors were the 6 excellent German cannons that they seized, and it seems that the Germans were good at mechanics and building and manufacturing even back then because of how many accounts there were of how amazing these cannons were. After the battle, Washington ordered his men to treat the Hessian prisoners with humanity, and it is said that he went to meet the dying Colonel Rahl himself, perhaps as he was being carried away to his quarters to die. It just shows the gentlemanly side of Washington as well. As, well, come over and I'll kill most of your men, but I'll at least give you a decent eye to eye. And Colonel Rahl said that he was satisfied that it was not necessary for him to outlive his honor. It was said of him, basically. So he was an honorable man, and when he died of his wounds, his adjutant wrote that he was satisfied that it was not necessary for him to outlive his honor. And that I included just to show you that this was not, Colonel Rahl was not the barbaric Hessian soldier that you would hear in many of these stories. He was an honorable man and a good soldier, and he was bested on the field of battle. And when the army crossed back over the Delaware River, which was pretty much as dangerous and as difficult as it was on the first trip over, the news from Trenton began to spread. Its first and largest impact was in America, where many people received it as this vindication of their cause. A lot of people deeply believed that the Battle of Trenton was a sign of God's redeeming providence and proof that the Continental Army was his instrument. In a more secular form, the attitude was very strong in the Army, that reflected the sentiment written by Captain William Hull. Quote, "The resolution and bravery of our men, their order and regularity gave me the highest sensation of pleasure. What can't men do when engaged in so noble a cause?" This completely reinvigorated the American revolutionary movement. Reports of the battle traveled extremely quickly through all the colonies. In 11 days, it reached the frontier settlements of this out in middle nowhere county in Virginia, where a British loyalist named Nicholas Creswell was being kept under restraint. And he wrote in a diary on January 6th, "News that Washington had taken 760 Hessian prisoners at Trenton in the Jerseys. Hope it is a lie." It was. He took more than that. When he heard it was true, he continued and said, quote, "The news is confirmed. The minds of the people are much altered. A few days ago, they had given up the cause for lost. Their late successes have turned the scale, and now they are all liberty mad again." That just goes to show you the effect of this Battle of Trenton, this crossing of the Delaware. It was so much more than just a military victory. Like I said in, I believe, the previous episode, or maybe earlier in this almost 2-hour long episode itself, Washington was able to embody the entire revolutionary movement, and he was the physical form of that, and he was the inspiration for that. And this Battle of Trenton was the culmination of all those things coming together. It was the downtrodden army, some of the men naked, no shoes, the very dejected citizens, and they were living under the rule of the Hessians, or the Redcoats, as they had occupied their colonies. And Washington himself, his attitude, he was just very down. And all of that began to change with a lot of different forces came into play for that. But, Thomas Paine's pamphlet and everything. But ultimately, it was Washington's determination and leadership for this cause that continued the cause. Because before this, like that British prisoner wrote, they were ready to give up. It just didn't seem possible. And somehow Washington was able to militarily pull off this incredible attack, but the effect of it won them so much more than a military victory. It enlarged the international debate on the American Revolution. It raised questions about the legitimacy of Europe's old regime and their colonial order. In all of these ways, the Battle of Trenton transformed attitudes towards the War of Independence on both sides of the Atlantic. And none of that would have happened unless George Washington, in a revolutionary way, led the way that he did. And because of the way that he did lead, this American Revolution that was almost doomed to fail before it even began, instead of just flickering out, it was a truly revolutionary experience. And it was all because of the leadership, the failure, and the resolve of really the nation's first and most famous leader, George Washington. And his crossing of the Delaware River that day, it wasn't just a physical crossing, it was a symbolic crossing. And it was the point in which America began to become America. Because up until that point, it was a rebellious group of colonies. And in a lot of ways, when he crossed the river, he brought back with him America. Because before that, it was just a bunch of rebels fighting off a dictator. And during that battle, Washington was able to establish what it looks like to be an American and how Americans fight for what they believe in. And it was a cause that was ignited all throughout the country.